In cutting-edge technologies and jobs of the future, moderated by publisher and futurist Forbes Media, Rich Karlgaard.
Well, good afternoon. I hope you all enjoyed lunch and the lunch panel. A really terrific panel. And our panel today is kind of a continuation of the same idea about shared prosperity. But this, I like to feel that we're on the leading edge of all of this, talking about technology issues. We have an all-star panel. I couldn't be more thrilled than to be the person who gets to sit here amongst all these bright minds. We have at the end, Jim Whitehurst, the CEO of Red Hat, which is now part of IBM. IBM paid 1/3 of its own market cap for Red Hat. Tells you how much they value what Jim and his team are doing down there. Doug Merritt is the CEO of Splunk, formerly was at PeopleSoft. Right next to me is Peggy Johnson, who's the Executive Vice President of Business Development at a little company in Redmond, Washington, Microsoft. Then is Ravi Kumar, who's the CEO of Infosys, has really taken Infosys into a new and exciting and high-growth direction. And then Chris Liddell, whom I met many years ago when he was at Microsoft, and today he's the assistant to the president and a deputy chief of staff, and really in charge of, I like to think of it as the president's technology advisor. I want to ask the question of all the panelists first, just to set the context of why we're having a panel like this and this year. About 18 months ago at a Forbes conference for chief information officers, Diane Greene, who was the co-founder of VMware back in the 90s and was at the time the CEO of Google Cloud, a position she held until January this year, said something astonishing. And I think people didn't quite absorb what she was saying. She said the era of Moore's Law is over. The era of this predictable rate of progression of where digital technology, where the gating factor allows progression of about a doubling every 18 months to 2 years. And I figured she was going to say it was slower because progression at the semiconductor level indeed is slowing down. Things are just getting too dense, too expensive, maybe a doubling every 3 years, smart people tell me. But instead, she said it's faster. It's not slowing down, it's not going to be the same, it's moving 2 to 3 times faster. As a result of the confluence of all these superpower technologies like hybrid elastic cloud computing, supercomputing power available to anybody in the cloud, 4G moving soon to 5G, new AI algorithms that will empower machine learning and AI to a whole nother level, all kind of happening at once. So I want to ask the panel, do you see the same thing happening? Do you sense whether it's exactly as Diane Greene described, 2 to 3 times faster, or some level faster? Would you agree with her general proposition, Jim, and then we'll move down the panel?
Yeah, I have been amazed over the last decade how much faster information technology is moving. And I think it's because there's a set of enabling technologies that are each moving at a slightly different cadence and speed, but together when you combine, for instance, advances in storage layered with advances in compute, layered with advances in what we can do around big data, layered with advances in analytics, those things in the end become almost a multiplicative benefit. So when you start saying analytics gets the benefit of all of those stacked on top of each other. So it's definitely moving just at an extraordinary pace every 6 months.
And we'll go on and talk about, after everybody addresses this, then how organizationally we meet the challenge, how we invest in new technologies, invest in people, bring it all together. But Doug, what are you seeing out there in terms of the raw rate of capability?
Strong agreement, and to add to what Jim said, I think you add in the network effect of now billions of people that are sharing that platform of storage, network, compute. and the data that's being generated as we really, really start to live this digital transformation that people have been talking about and has been the hype for a decade. Our largest customer, as one customer, is processing almost 10 petabytes of data per day that they're analyzing. They're both processing and analyzing 10 petabytes of data per day. And for context, you think about when we actually started taking a snapshot of the internet in the mid-90s just for preservation basis. And the totality from the mid-90s through today is less than 20 petabytes of data across everything that is the web. So the rate of innovation that you can start to enjoy as you have billions of people talking, throwing off zettabytes of data that those algorithms and the data scientists and increasingly common people can begin to, or non-data scientists, those of us that don't have an advanced ML degree, can actually start to participate in. It's astounding what's happening.
Peggy? Well, Microsoft is, along with Intel, the big winner of the Moore's Law period of digital technology. How do you look at the pace of innovation?
So definitely accelerating, for sure. And I think it's the confluence of a lot of things: faster networks, cloud computing, computing all the way to the edge. So now we have everything sensored up, and all of that data is coming back. But what's feeding that is this digital transformation that companies are going through. So every company is literally becoming a technology company. They feel that pressure to step that up. They've got access to these data pools, and they want to reason across them and surface new insights that hopefully can give them a differentiating edge in the market. So I think feeding sort of the confluence of the technology is the business pressure. I've got to jump in this game as well, and that kind of gets the flywheel going.
Well, just a quick follow-up. Do you think the recognition throughout many industries and many kinds of companies, has it sunk in that things are moving faster, that if they don't really meet the challenge of digital transformation, they're going to be left behind awfully quick?
It's going at different speeds amongst different industries. We find the industries that have access to large data pools are some of the early adopters, because they have this access, they know there's value in those data pools, and they need help unlocking it. So those seem to be the classical industries that are moving most quickly into the cloud and digitally transforming their businesses.
Ravi, at Infosys, you have a lens into the entire global economy and how all of this is rolling out. Do you agree with the proposition that at the root level, digital technology is moving at a rate some factor faster than it was 10 years before, 5 years before?
Absolutely. It's pervasive across industries. Just to add on to what the other panelists spoke about, I've read a report on the future of jobs. 75 million jobs of the past are going to go away by 2022, and 35 million jobs of the future are going to be created by new age digital technologies. So new age digital technologies are going to take away jobs of the past, but they're going to create an accelerated journey for jobs of the future. So that's one pivot I wanted to talk about. The second one I wanted to talk about, a little different to what the other panelists spoke about, just to complement what they said. The future of work is changing because of digital technologies. Workplaces had private human capital, and workplaces of the future would have private human capital amplified by public human capital coming from the gig economy, and then amplified by machines. Machines will do the problem solving. The gig economy or the public human capital is going to get you the agility, the variability, and the scale, and the private human capital is going to focus on creative jobs which are related to experience. And that's what the digital economy is going to do. It's going to create a human plus gig plus machines kind of a ecosystem.
Yeah, I want to come back to that. Your formulation is really intriguing. Humans plus gigs plus machines, and matching that effectively, but we'll come back. Chris, you built a career in information technology, and now you're an advisor to the President of the United States and his administration about this. Now, as fast as things can theoretically move at the level of digital technology, faster today, government in its executive branch, legislative branches, regulatory branches, is purposely designed not to move that fast. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a stable society. How do you, with one foot in one world and now one foot in the other, how do you look at that and maybe do your job to evangelize to other people in government in all the various branches that, hey, this stuff is moving fast, we've got to have a plan for it, and what is that plan?
Yeah, sure. So in my role, I actually run policy coordination for the whole White House, so not just technology. But these issues cut across multiple agencies and multiple components of the White House, so it sits inside my domain. The way I look at it is all exponential change looks linear for a period of time until you hit about the 45-degree mark, and then you suddenly realize it's exponential. And what we have is effectively that in the areas we're talking about. So what I've spent most of my time in the last couple of years thinking about is how do you mesh policy making, which, as you say correctly, doesn't move exponentially, certainly in Washington, D.C., and make it effective in that environment. And that is in particular thinking about how the blended model of the private and public sector work together in a country like the US. So, and I'm happy to go a little bit more deeper into it, but when we think about the global race in the industries of the future, in particular against places like China, thinking about how we maximize this blended approach of unleashing innovation in the private sector is clearly going to be one of the most important things we do from a policy point of view. So it's not just what the government does itself, it's what it does to unleash the other people on the stage to do the things they do. That is a much more successful model in an exponential environment than a top-down one, and I could talk a little bit more about that.
And a quick follow-up to that, how much is driven by sort of the affirmative possibilities, the things that can happen to facilitate growth of the economy, facilitate really cool new companies and new jobs with technologies coming down the pike like 5G, and how much of it is facilitated, or how much of this conversation is driven by some kind of a fear that we're going to get beaten some critical technology by some country, or that we're going to be increasingly vulnerable to some major hack or theft of data?
Well, let me give you a framework for thinking about policy development inside the government and then apply it to this. And I'll just use the framework of our host's theme, which is shared prosperity, which has two words in it. One's prosperity and the other's shared. So if I start with prosperity and then I move to shared. So from a prosperity point of view, obviously in the short term, we're doing pretty well. So we're running along at 3% economic growth. And that's on the back of some foundational work, in particular around corporate tax reform and deregulation. Those won't change. And those are massive unleashers of innovation, in particular on the deregulatory side. So that allows certainly the foundations for success. But in the long term, winning in what we describe as the industries of the future is going to be critical to the prosperity of the country. So that's 5G, artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, advanced manufacturing, and quantum computing. When I think about those and I think about the role of the government, the easiest way to think about policy is the government effectively has three roles in the country. We're a spender, we're a regulator, and we're an owner. We spend a lot of money, about 20% of the economy. We regulate the whole country, and we own a whole lot of assets which are useful in the development of any policy. So when I think of the industries of the future, we spend, it's interesting, China, we'll just take China versus the US, although obviously the rest of the world's important as well. China and the US spend about the same on R&D, about $500 billion. In the US case, though, 150 of that's government and 350 of it's private sector. So making that system work relative to the 500 in China, which is more top-down, is critical. So when we think about the $150 billion that the government spends, it's critical how we spend it. And the way that I think about that is it should be directed where there are areas of market failure inside the private sector. So we shouldn't be replicating what the private sector is doing. We should be working on the areas where there's no obvious economic return in the short term, like quantum computing, which will unleash innovation in due course when there is an economic model that the private sector can pick up. So spending the $150 billion that we do more effectively is incredibly important. The other thing that's important is spending more. This is probably one area where I would certainly support us spending more as a government. So there's actually a meeting tomorrow with Speaker Pelosi and Minority Leader Schumer coming in to talk to the President about infrastructure. From my point of view, one of the key elements of infrastructure is digital infrastructure. We typically think of infrastructure in the physical sense, but digital infrastructure is going to be incredibly important. So expanding national labs and creating quantum, for example, should be part of an infrastructure bill if we can get there. So that's on the sort of dollars spent. And I'll go reasonably quickly, but happy to deep dive on any of it. On the regulatory side, the government has two things, legislation and regulation. On legislation, infrastructure is a big one. There's essentially three big opportunities in the short term. Infrastructure is one, immigration is another. So obviously getting the right people and getting the right legal immigration system in the country, for example, H-1B, merit-based system is going to be critically important. So that's another big thing that Jared Kushner is pushing. And then trade. So the USMCA, mostly we think about trade in terms of physical goods, but one of the big benefits of the USMCA is chapter that sits inside that, and part of the negotiations with China are obviously going to be around intellectual property protection. So there's three, passing USMCA, doing something on digital infrastructure and a comprehensive immigration reform. It's unlikely that we'll get all three of those done, but if we can make significant progress on that in this administration, that would be huge in terms of this particular area. That's on legislation. On regulation, there's lots of things we can do that don't require legislation. So drone experimentation, autonomous vehicle regulation, and so forth are incredibly important. And then the last thing is, last component of what the government does is ownership. So we own incredibly important assets in this particular discussion. So spectrum is the most obvious one in terms of 5G rollout, but there's things like all the national labs and the massive computing that they have that they can make available to startups. And then the last and not least is data. So artificial intelligence requires data to be effective. We're facing 1.4 billion people. Unleashing government data is critical to unleashing innovation. So we saw that. The most obvious example is GPS. When we let GPS out, look what happened. So the government has these massive repositories of data. Think about healthcare, which is the biggest industry in the country and the most inefficient. Massive amounts of data that if we unleash from a government point of view, that's probably the biggest asset we can contribute. So that sort of covers the breadth of it. I can get a bit into workforce development because that's the shared side of prosperity, but I've probably used up most of my time.
Since you opened the door, we're going to talk both about investing for technologies in the future and then investing in our workforces. Let's talk about investing in technologies in the future. We'll start with you, Ravi. How does Infosys look at that? There seems to have there's a rising desire of a lot of companies to do a lot of their investments through partnerships.
Yep.
Either internal venture capital arms that aren't investing strictly for return on investment, but are investing for just to get close to startup cutting-edge companies, and in partnerships and collaborations. You saw the ultimate partnership and collaboration becoming an even tighter partnership with IBM and Red Hat. What's your philosophy for investing in the future? How do you have a portfolio of things so that you're assured of winning?
Sure, absolutely. And this is a very passionate topic for me. I hope I just don't go on and stop me if I'm taking more time. Over the last 2 decades or so, Infosys built this extraordinary training infrastructure, and we hired thousands of engineers in India. And what we've done in the last 2 years in the United States is to use the culture of learning and education and build a partnership with state governments and academia to build a training infrastructure in the US to build digital talent pools which don't exist today. And that's been our endeavor. So we've hired like 9,500 in the last 2 years in the United States locally. And we orchestrated it with academic ecosystems where we partnered and ran finishing schools, if I may. In the digital economy, on one side, you need deep programming skills. On the other side, you need a breadth of skills which would apply technology to businesses and embrace technology to businesses. That's a much bigger virtue than the technology itself. So we took a cut on STEM talent in schools and colleges in the US. We ran an 8 to 12-week finishing school along with some universities, and we created talent which doesn't exist today. So that was one part of our journey. So we worked with Purdue University on cybersecurity. We worked with North Carolina State University on data and analytics. We worked with Udacity, a company in the Silicon Valley, on autonomous technologies. And we realized that 8 to 12 weeks is good enough to build tech digital talent pools of the future. The second thing we did was we progressed and we realized that liberal arts is going to play a very big role. Problem finding is a much bigger virtue than problem solving in the digital economy. Problem solving will be relegated to machines. Problem finding, the creative part of it, is what all large enterprises are looking for. So we embraced liberal arts, and we created a stream of talent coming out of liberal arts schools. The third thing we did is every large enterprise today is almost paranoid about experience gaps, which have created new age digital companies. There is an experience gap, you create a new digital company. So design talent is a very important aspect of the digital economy. So we partnered with design schools, backgrounds in humanity, and we created design talent for the future. So in this journey, what we needed is partnership with state governments, partnership with academia. Going beyond STEM, we demystified that STEM is actually the need of the hour. Liberal arts and design are going to play a very big role. And a training of 8 to 12 weeks can actually, it costs us roughly around $20,000 for every new hire.
Yeah.
We got that. What's also going to happen in the digital economy is the linear equation between higher studies and work is going to go into a continuum of lifelong learning.
Yeah. I want to come back.
Yeah,
I want to come back to that workforce development as a second aspect.
Yeah.
After we talk about how we invest in technologies of the future, and with your title as the head of business development at Microsoft, tell us exactly what that does. Are you looking for these strategic partnerships that are going to expand Microsoft? How do you balance what Microsoft invents on the inside? Microsoft has always been a great inventor of technology on the inside, and if there were a criticism of it, we'll blame it on the previous administration, that a lot of those great technologies didn't make it out into the marketplace as rapidly as they should have. And does that sort of lesson from the past shape how you look at investing in technology in the future?
So business development at Microsoft is all about growth for the company. And we generally do that through 3 different levers. Partnerships is one of them. We weren't always the best partner in the past. At times, it was a bit of a zero-sum game. And I do think that Satya brought in sort of a reimagining of our partnership ability. I'll come back to that. The other 2 levers are clearly acquisitions and investments. So since I started a few years back, we started a corporate venture fund called M12, and it gives us that early signal that we were missing because we really weren't as plugged into the startup community as we could have been. And being part of having an early stage fund has allowed us sort of back in that conversation.
So do you work with venture capital firms?
We do. We do.
You don't go it alone?
No, and we generally follow. We generally don't lead. But it's brought us so much signal in areas that were core to our ambitions. And it's just resurfaced a whole new ability to bring in very early stage tech so that we don't miss trends going forward. But coming back to partnership, one of the things that resonated so much with me, because I was many years at Qualcomm, never thought I was going to leave, is when I had my first discussion with Satya, and he talked about the importance of partnerships. And he asked me to sort of re-engage with the partner community to find ways where we could strategically align and generate growth for both of us. So rather than sort of fighting over a piece of the pie, he wants us to grow the pie for it. And I think from that, over the last several years, we've had a lot of surprising partnerships from Amazon, who we compete on the cloud, but we actually have a lot of areas of partnering with Amazon. Alexa and Cortana talk to each other, for instance. We have Skype inside of Echo. Yeah, it's
they complain, they threaten each other.
I think it's a pretty friendly conversation. But even with Splunk, we have a Splunk plugin on Microsoft 365. We have a great partnership with Red Hat. And all of that is sort of a renewed focus on partnerships because it's about our joint customers. We all have customers in common. And if we can take some friction out of their businesses by partnering and whatever spectrum is possible, we're going to do that.
One of the co-founders of Sun Microsystems, Bill Joy, said back in the day that when we finally get all connected with these high-speed networks, one of the effects will be that the talented people will have, that were previously undiscovered, will have an avenue for discovery, a literal avenue for discovery. And he said, at such a time when that happens, every company in the world is going to find out that the majority of the smartest people in the very thing that they do are on the outside, not in the inside. And Bill Joy was like one of those guys that was so far out there, people thought, what does he mean by that? But it's kind of proven true. And it really does put the emphasis on thinking of your company not as a wall and defined by people who are on the W-2 payroll, but as an ecology of partnerships that reach out into the world. Did it... Again, Microsoft was very well led by the previous leaders, but did it take Satya, in particular, in the way that he looks at the world, to see that Joy's law was really being fulfilled?
Yeah, I think when Satya stepped in, the company was being disrupted in a number of ways. Our business model, the industry around us, our competition, and he looked at that and knew that we had to have change on the campus. And I remember when I first met him, he said, I'm on a journey to change the culture. And he had just read the book Mindset by Carol Dweck, the Stanford psychologist, and it had a real impact on him, this idea of having a growth mindset. And the basic premise of that is if you have two people, one who's a know-it-all and one who's a learn-it-all, in the end, the learn-it-all will eventually come out on top, even if they start from a deficit. So if you ask questions, if you get to know the other side, if you have that ability to have that conversation, to say, what is it you need, rather than, I know what you want, or I know what you need, and here it is, it's my product. It's like, tell us about what you need, and we'll try to find a solution. And that changed the whole dynamic. And I think the thing that he did so well was he was consistent in that message. No matter what audience he was in front of, he talked about this concept of a growth mindset. I'm sure that both of you have heard that as well in your conversations with Satya. And it's just something that resonated, and the 130,000 employees were ready to embrace it, and they did.
Yeah, it's just been an astonishing story. I think I'll go on record as saying I think he's the best CEO in the world, is not a founder. Simply because it's fair to draw a line between founder CEOs and non-founder CEOs. Doug, how do you Splunk does a lot of acquisitions, so I know you have a good stake there. But how do you look at the portfolio of things that Splunk does to make sure that you're going to have a robust future?
Yeah, I think the themes that we've all been hitting on, and if you think about the systems we've been talking about and the layering and componentization that's happened within those systems, that changes the whole perspective of boundaries. We perceive boundaries. We perceive that there are physical boundaries in our body, and on the molecular level, it's super porous. The boundaries, I think, are largely artificial. And I think the new technology stacks that exist the whole point is to be able to mix and match very aggressively. And if you don't have a tech stack that allows that, I think it mirrors the business models that we're seeing. When I think about the profound impacts on companies, the business model shift mirrors the technological shift we're seeing, where we are layering and componentizing the businesses. You can see that with Ubers and the Airbnbs and the Lyfts of the world, where they are disaggregating, they're layering themselves on top of a world of physical assets and physical people, and then creating new mechanisms for value. So within Splunk, we think that same way. We are a data abstraction layer. We are more of a data fabric than owning data. We own pieces of data, but a lot of data passes through what we do, and our orientation is how open can we be to inputs and outputs of data, and through that, provide more rapid outcomes for our end users. If you're in a cybersecurity world, the whole concept of the borders of the company has completely blown up with our devices, and the thought that you've got a wall that you're going to get past is something that security has wrapped their minds around and is thinking completely differently. The data platform that supports that, whether it's security, cybersecurity, whether it's IT, whether it's next generation manufacturing, next generation marketing, or internal finance or HR, has to think through what is the landscape of all potential technologies, data, and users, and where do I fit within that landscape? And if I occupy just a few percentage points in some areas, as long as I'm making the whole better, then I'm contributing to this ML, AI, next generation future. And the more that you can create that unified experience, the better, going back to what Peggy was saying, for that customer back who's got a very difficult job of trying to integrate these hundreds or thousands of technologies. And so a lot of our internal development and acquisitions focus on the layers closest to the areas that we're providing most services for our customers, and how do we either increase the interoperability or add one more component that eases the rate of consumption and the time to outcome for our customers.
Is then spending money on internal R&D, is that just not as important as it once was? I mean, I see it as a sunk cost trap. You invest in your internal R&D, and then maybe it doesn't work out the way you wanted to, but you spend all that money on it, and now you're reluctant to give it up, or you try to force the fruits of it on some unwitting customer who doesn't want what your R&D produced. Jim?
Well, I think the biggest dynamic or major change we've seen in innovation is a move from vendor-led to user-led innovation. If you look at almost any of the major technologies around big data, machine learning, AI, analytics, they didn't come from vendors. They've typically come from open source communities. So it's the Googles and the Facebooks and the Lyfts and the Twitters who are solving problems themselves and putting that code out to be used broadly. That's why Microsoft paid a lot of money for GitHub, right? If you think about the Industrial Revolution, the winners in the Industrial Revolution weren't the machine tool makers, right? They were the people who perfected mass manufacturing, the people who are doing it every day. And if you think about cloud, at least in the context of like an Amazon or a Google, it's a byproduct of their current business. Big data exists because Google needed to index the World Wide Web, and Yahoo needed to do it as well. And so these open source projects developed that allowed that to happen. So when we think about innovation broadly, whether it's from a public policy perspective or just individual companies we work with, is to really think hard about, well, where does it make sense to build something and hold on to it versus sharing, being involved in communities where the ultimate impact of that's bigger. I mean, you look at Facebook and Google are big-time competitors in some ways, yet they collaborate every day in infrastructure software, adding new innovations. And so I think recognizing the source of innovation, so much of that is coming from users, however you want to define users, whether that's the Web 2.0s, but a lot of large companies, and how you actually take that and leverage it and build on it, I think it's going to be important for all of us involved in technology.
Yeah, you surprised me by saying, I guess I should have, I wasn't paying attention as close as I should have, but here's IBM that trades a third of its market cap for Red Hat, and here's Red Hat without any IP. What did they buy?
Well, we're a software company with no intellectual property, yes. Well, it's a capability to, exactly that. It's a capability to work with communities to take this software and make it accessible and usable by enterprises. So, you know, our projects were typically less than 20% of the code that's contributed upstream to the projects, but we can take that code and help enterprises use it. And we'll talk about it when we talk about skilling up a workforce in the future. The ability to collaborate, to listen, to get involved and contribute to a whole is going to be such an important skill, because more and more as we go forward, minds are spread out, not just at other IT vendors. It's not just there are more minds at your competitors, there are more minds at your customers as well, and how you actually work across those broader communities to make sure that you're extracting the best ideas and intellectual property and then propelling that forward is incredibly important. Well, certainly for us as a company, I certainly think Microsoft and what they've done with GitHub validates that. But I think broadly, as we think about companies in general, how you participate and get involved in that's going to be critically important for the future.
Well, good on that. Let's segue to, I think, one of the most important questions that countries around the world need to ask right now, and need to come up with some good solutions fast, and that is, in an age of accelerating digital technology. I'm going to go to Chris first, then we'll mix it up among the other panelists. In an age of accelerating digital technology, as Mayor Garcetti said, there's a lot of excitement out there, but there's a lot of anxiety and fear too. And as Mike Clouden said in his introduction, that the fear is at such a level that buy-in for free enterprise is shakier maybe than it's been, not only in the United States, but around the world. And it's pushing people to the radicalized populist left or the radicalized populist right. So take your pick, communism or fascism. So it means that free enterprise really has to shore up this idea of shared prosperity. And that starts with developing a workforce that is capable of contributing to and sharing the prosperity. So what's the administration's view on that, Chris?
I totally agree. And so to the second word, shared and shared prosperity, we've done a great job over the last 30 or 40 years of driving GDP growth, but we haven't done a particularly good job of actually seeing everyone share the benefits of that. And it's going to be even more critical in the next decade or so. You know, we won't win the industries of the future unless we actually build the workforce of the future. So take that as a given. In terms of looking at some of the solutions, we need innovation at every aspect of the education system. And firstly, we need to sort of reimagine what education means, start thinking about it as lifelong learning, so that it's not just a periodic, an episodic event and then you go off into the workforce. You need to start thinking about it from a whole of life perspective, and we need massive amounts of innovation. In terms of what the government's doing from a public policy point of view, we set up this entity called the National Council for the American Worker. There were, and had an advisory board attached to it. 3 members of that were in the last panel, so some of you might have seen that. I won't repeat all of what they've said, but basically looking at how do we reform K through 12, how do we reform the higher education system, and how do we work with the private sector to think about retraining programs from both a public and private partnership perspective. In terms of the first couple, the Higher Education Act is coming up for reauthorization possibly this year. How we spend the money in that is going to be absolutely critical. Things like extending Pell Grants to much more shorter-term programs. At the moment, they're essentially only Pell Grants for lower-income people to go to college. They're orientated more to traditional programs. That makes no sense in the world that we're going into, where programs can be much more micro and targeted. So extending Pell Grants to be shorter term is a huge opportunity. Changing the accreditation system so that we don't just accredit 4 and 2-year degrees. We've convinced people that the only way you're going to succeed is by having a college degree, and that can't make any sense in the world that we're going into. And the statistics are pretty damning. 4-year degrees, the percentage of people who graduate in 4-year degrees within 6 years is 64, 65%. So a third of people don't finish 4-year degrees. For 2-year degrees, it's a third of people graduate, 2/3 don't. So bizarrely, we are forcing more people into the system and we're graduating less than we were 20 years ago. So we have to rethink that. Part of that is going to be driving towards vocational education, reorientating the money and the policies into more vocational aspects. So we covered a lot of that in the previous panel, but the great thing from my perspective is that we've actually got a fantastic group of private people and public people. You know, some of the companies represented, IBM is part of the council, thinking about, firstly, how we reorientate the current system and then the retraining. And one anecdote I'll give on the retraining is I used to be CFO of a number of companies, and one thing I ask all CFOs now when I meet them is, how much do you spend on training? And generally speaking, the answer is, I don't know, which I wouldn't have known either. It's not a line item that we actually have. We can tell you to the dollar what you spend on healthcare or other things, but training isn't a line item that most companies traditionally focus on. To the extent they can answer, it's something like $500 a person per year, and it's orientated more to the senior people than lower levels. So we spend something like $10,000 a year educating people and then $500 a year retraining them. That can't make sense. So the whole system needs a massive amount of innovation that will be facilitated by the government, but carried out in partnership with the private sector.
I've lived in Silicon Valley my adult life, and over the course of that now fairly long life, it's gone from a valley of literal silicon semiconductor companies to tinkerers in garages, people who had very practical knowledge about things. And today, if a Martian landed, it would be algorithmic valley. Now, I'm struck by the fact that when you look at the most valuable tech companies in the United States, which are also the most valuable companies in the world, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, I guess you could throw Berkshire Hathaway in there somewhere to break it up. What those technology companies I mentioned all have in common is at least one of the founders of those companies scored a perfect 800 on their math SAT. Now that is an idea that trickles down into the valley and into the way the valley and the leading edge technology companies think about talent. And I think it's led to this. This bias that nobody wants to name out there. That unless you are a company with that kind of intellectual horsepower, or just say algorithmic horsepower, because we're talking about a pretty narrow range of skills here in a world where there are many forms of intelligence. Unless you have that, the equivalent of 4.4 in an NFL 40-yard dash or something, that you can't really compete in the technology arena. And maybe people who don't do that well, regardless of whether they might be brilliant electricians or plumbers or some of the things that Ivanka Trump named at lunch, or somehow, they're going to fall by the wayside. Well, if that happens, there are more of them than there are people who scored 800 on the math SAT. Then you have the populist revolt. How do we make sure that, and I'll ask you this, Chris, and then I'll throw it open for everybody. How do we make sure that in a technology-driven, high-performance economy, that we're bringing everybody up, if not all, the majority of people to motivate them and to give them the skills and bring them up? Because if we don't, then we're going to wind up with a really unstable political system.
Yeah, so one statistic, and then I'll answer your question. McKinsey did some great work here, which I recall, which basically says only around 5% of jobs are going to disappear in the next decade or so, but around 60% of jobs are going to have a significant amount of their job changed. So it's not about turning everyone into a coder, it's giving everyone the basic knowledge and understanding of technology and the application of their job. That's a slightly different task. How do you do that? Firstly, you've got to start K through 12. Clearly, we need STEM education, but it doesn't need more broad-based STEM education. But again, it's not STEM education with the idea that we're going to turn everyone into a technician. It's STEM education so that every kid can understand how technology influences their creativity or whatever their aspect it is. Then in the higher education system, shorter-term degrees make much more sense. So actually looking at 6, 8, 10, 12-week programs, which again are technology focused, but are much more orientated towards the application of technology in the person's job. And thinking about apprenticeships in a broader sense, so that they're not just construction, but they're apprenticeships in a true sense of any job. So earn and learn programs make much more sense in so taking people and not turning them into technologists, but giving them the technology skills to actually work inside their jobs.
Yeah, Ravi, I know you've got some deep thoughts on here.
Yeah, so, I think Chris was bang on. K-12 schools need a much bigger embrace of computer science education. Only 30% of the schools in the US actually use that as a foundational skill. The digital economy is going to make everybody a learner, a lifelong learner. So in schools, you have to learn how to learn, and then you go through the process of learning all your life and be a lifelong learner. The ability to learn is very important. Governments across the world are wired for the first 20 years of citizens and the last 20 years of citizens. In the digital economy, the change happens in the middle. So how do you get governments to build that infrastructure to support in the middle? That's where the change is. I did speak about how the world is going to move from higher education, a straight line of higher education to work, to a continuum of lifelong learning. Who takes the accountability of lifelong learning? Is it the government or the individuals or the organizations they work in, or it's a shared responsibility? There was this distinctive difference of white collar and blue collar jobs for years. I think that's going to blur. There's going to be new collar jobs, and we've made this massive experiment on community colleges at Infosys, and we found that to be very exciting for us. Community colleges have only 30% pass out rate. 50% of the students in the US actually go to community colleges. We think you're going to move to skills from higher education, and community colleges will play a very important role. We have hired quite a few in the last 12 months, and we're going to almost increase that capacity 4 or 5 times in the next 12 months, because we do believe that's a hidden talent pool in the United States nobody has tapped into. The moment you're going to break the higher education,
could not agree with you more on that.
I think that's going to take off.
Yeah.
So these are a bunch of things which will come into the digital economy. While we need deep programming skills and STEM skills at one side of the spectrum, digital will have such a broad embrace that you're going to have liberal arts and skills which are beyond STEM play a very important role on applying technology to businesses, which is a much bigger virtue than just the technology itself. So I do think the divide, in some sense, what the tech revolution kind of had a perceived divide, that divide, we have a chance to bridge it. We have a much better chance to bridge it with the embrace of digital technologies.
Well, thank you. Jim, you've been part of the IBM ecology for some time and now are formally part of that. And I know Ginny Rometty is really doing great work with P-Tech and some of these other things. Even though you're coming into a company that was doing that, can you describe what P-Tech is and maybe how that will, how Red Hat, how did you think about talent and talent training along the way too?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that digital technology is exploding, and that's phenomenal. That doesn't mean everybody needs to be a technologist. In fact, I'm not sure you want someone with an 800 on the math of their SAT designing the user interface for your automobile or even for your iPhone apps, right? You want somebody who's creative, who thinks the way the average person thinks, right? So first off, as we start thinking about skilling people, absolutely people need to have facility with technology and enough of an understanding that they understand what's out there. But great technologists are going to make the technology invisible. And what that means is the jobs that go away are the ones that technology can replace, which are things that are more automatable. And so the jobs that are left require just a tremendous degree of growth in creativity, in ability to collaborate, much more human skills, because those are the things that aren't going to be easily automatable, right? And I think when we look at the education system that we have, it is so focused on hard skills versus soft skills. And I see this in technology all the time, where people are needing to build, whether it's a new application or dream of something new, and technologists, that's not what they've been good at. It's a little bit, most of us in our academic careers probably write 100 term papers on book reports or history or et cetera, and 1 or 2 creative writing exercises. Yet most of us, when we're out in our careers, as technology becomes so ubiquitous and relatively easy to use, most of us are going to have to do the creating writing exercise, whether that's building a new application or dreaming up a new component in business. And we're not skilling up our people to do that. Specifically around Red Hat, the first thing we start with is, certainly we want technical people because we have a lot of technical roles, is how good are they at collaborating? How good are they at working with other people? Because the idea of one brilliant engineer coming up with some new insight, I think those stories are told, but they're often incorrect when you go back and look at them. It's generally a brilliant person working with some other brilliant people, and really figuring out how you, build our ability to create, but then realizing that that happens with people working together become the two really most important things that we need to skill our people for, which is almost the antithesis of the education system that we have today, which is about getting things wrong is bad, right? Yet the core of our capitalist system is taking risks and failing and learning and innovating.
Yeah, and just you might say a word or two about P-Tech, even you know more about it than I do, even if that's not your expertise. I think it's a great idea of how IBM is working with kids from poorer and more challenged communities to provide an introduction. I mean, these are kids who, believe me, probably didn't even know there was an SAT test, let alone had tens of thousands of dollars to prep for it over 4 years. And so this is another of these vast untapped pools of talent that IBM is going into. At the same time, it's doing something societally really useful.
Well, I think all of us have to recognize that, frankly, anyone in this room has been pretty fortunate. And part of this idea of businesses and building a sustainable ecosystem, at least at Red Hat, and I'll speak to Red Hat, not IBM as much. When we talk about our competitors, we mainly talk about our competitors for talent more than we talk about our competitors in the product market. And we are in woefully short supply of talent, and so IBM has made myriad investments across a number of areas, and really appreciate what they've done there. To whether it is working with very early aged and underprivileged all the way through high schools, through colleges, through kind of many different areas. And again, as an employer of hundreds of thousands of people, working to build that ecosystem, I think something pretty extraordinary that I know they've done. I know other companies have as
good.
well.
The clock's winding down, which leaves us just enough time, and I'm going to go to Doug, and then Peggy can run anchor leg on that. And so, Doug, how do you think about talent development, and particularly some of the great ideas that have been put forth that as design is becoming more important, user interface is becoming more important because we have these incredible tools to work with. So how does that change things?
Yeah, I think your Bill Joy quote is as applicable or more applicable to the educational community as it is to everything else out there. We talk about over-the-top everything right now. My younger 20-something-year-old colleagues never subscribe to cable. They just directly go to HBO or Netflix. And we see that with education. The amazing wealth of educational material from 1-minute format all the way up to full courseware that's available over the top for anyone that's motivated and has access to technology is overwhelming. And so much of our energy is focused on policy and the traditional channels, and I think that's really important to continue to iterate. But Splunk, like everybody on the panel, has a whole host of educational initiatives that we are working with, from Europe, that was mentioned earlier in the panel led by Eric Schmidt, to veteran education and getting a safe path for veterans in the workplace, to people that have chosen to vacate the workplace for whatever reason for a while and need to come back in. And I think what's interesting is the formal educational approaches to help get them up to speed, as Ravio is going through with the 6, 8, and 12-week courses, combined with some of the informal and richness of educational material that lives out there, and then more virtual certification and authentication mechanisms so you can reach anybody anywhere as long as they have access to the internet and to technology. I think that's one of the highest bars that we have. Goodness happens, areas of enlightenment, as education is liberal, as information is liberal. The printing press did wonderful things, and if you want to clamp down on society, make sure they don't get access to data and information. And I think making sure that we keep a very sharp mind on how do we make sure that all 7+ billion of us have that opportunity, because once you're there, the richness is pretty astounding.
Peggy, you raised the point about Satya Nadella's admiration for Carol Dweck's book, Mindset. written in 2006. I have a book that came out last week called Late Bloomers, and after this panel, I'll be signing it in the bookstore, and thanks to Jamie Montgomery of March Capital, the first 200 books are free. And if you don't want it, there's a review coming out tomorrow. I don't know whether it's a good or bad review in the Wall Street Journal, but it's coming out tomorrow. And I interviewed Carol Dweck, and Carol Dweck told me something pretty alarming. She said that the kids that she sees at Stanford today, and I interviewed her in the fall in 2016, are, in her words, exhausted and brittle, and they don't want to mar their perfect records. So how do we crack that? So that we've created a monster, is my view in Late Bloomers, unwittingly, but we have. And how do we keep people on a growth? How do we combine the need to sort of measure people's performance without locking them into a position where they know they're being measured for their performance, therefore they game the measurements, is basically what we have in school today, and you're not getting what you think you're getting.
So, I mean, if you're talking just about the broad base of students coming out, you said something earlier, about those who get 800 on their SATs.
Well, one of them is Bill Gates.
Yeah, and is the world just for them? And when we think about that, we go back to our mission statement at Microsoft, which is to empower every person and organization on the planet to achieve more, whether or not you have 800 on your SATs or not. And we're a technology company. We create technology, but we think a lot about creating that technology, not for what the technology can do, but for what it should do. And I think when you think beyond the kids who get 800 on their SATs, there's a whole world of folks out there who don't. And so how can we...
Like 99.99%.
Yeah, I didn't get 800 on my SAT. So how do we enable and empower all of those people? And I think technology can be a channel to do that, definitely. And we see that, for instance, in something we've been doing with first-line workers. So first-line workers are the folks behind the counters in the clinics, on the factory floor. They're the people who oftentimes are the first person your customers see, those first-line workers. About 2 billion people in the world who are first-line workers. And can tech empower them? Absolutely. They don't have to be technologists, but tech can power them. And so we have a big focus on that at Microsoft. And one of the examples is Chevron. So they have oil refineries all over the world, and they have lower skilled technicians out at those refineries, and when something would go wrong, they would have to send experts from Houston out to these refineries. Now, through HoloLens, the mixed reality device that we work with, these lower skilled technicians can put those devices on, and they still see the world out there, but in front of this oil refinery machinery, data is imposed on top of that. The expert can be talking to them and saying, okay, what you need to do is turn this crank and do this. And you can think how empowering that technician has just become. They're the hero. They're the ones who fixed it. They didn't have to send somebody from Houston out. So I think we can really change that entire dynamic through technology. It can be a force for good.
Yeah, I will attest that I actually tried it out in Redmond, and I did my first piece of electronics work and probably last piece of electronics
with your
work,
HoloLens.
thanks to the HoloLens. I want to thank the whole panel for this really important panel. Let's give them a big hand.